Good evening, everyone. My name is Raymond E. I'm one of the councillors on the AIIA branch. Can I begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands upon which we are holding tonight's event and pay my respect to their elders past and present, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and any Indigenous members in our audience today, here in person or online. May I also acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which those of us joining us online are joining us from. Today's topic, Views of and from the Pacific Neighbourhood, a joint event of the Griffith Asia Institute and the AIIA Queensland, is an event which is particularly dear to my own heart. The Pacific Islands region looms larger in the imagination of Australians than has been the case for many years. The place of the Pacific countries and communities in big conversations, whether related to climate, pandemics, economic growth, cultural exchange, or security, is becoming more and more mainstream. Increased and improved reporting by the Australian media has made a contribution to this, particularly as they engage more often with respected voices of Pacific leaders. This evening, it is my absolute pleasure. Please have a seat. Oh, thank you. This evening, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our two very distinguished speakers who will be in conversation with one another. Can I begin with Dame Meg, or as she has commanded me to refer to her as Meg. Meg has an absolutely, thank you, enviable CV, lawyer, athlete, and diplomat. The summary I'm about to give you does no justice to a CV, but by way of summary, can I mention this? As a citizen of PNG, she received her law degree from the University of Melbourne and an LLM from Harvard University. She practiced law in PNG and served as a member of the Law Reform Commission there. From 2014 to 2021, she served as the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, the first female SG of the Pacific Forum. Meg was knighted in 2002 when she was made a Dame Commander of the, but more excitingly, in 1971, she won silver and bronze in the South Pacific Games, representing PNG in pentathlon and the 4x100 relay. Meg is currently based in PNG, where she serves on the board of Number One Super and the PNG Sustainable Development Program. She is a member of the International Advisory Panel for the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank and as an advisor to Ocean Blue Law. Stefan Armbruster, apologies, Stefan, for butchering your name, is an award-winning correspondent with over 30 years of reporting experience in Australia and overseas. Stefan's asked me to significantly reduce his introduction, so let me talk about what he's been doing most recently. During the last decade, Stefan's been based in London, where he has been practicing as a journalist and a senior producer at the BBC Radio 4's flagship Today current affairs program, the World Service, and then the groundbreaking News Online platform, as well as reporting and producing for Dow Jones and CNBC. Returning to Australia in 2003, he was the senior producer at ABC News Online before becoming SBS World News Brisbane-based correspondent covering Queensland and the Pacific region. Ladies and gentlemen, Meg and Stefan.
Thank you very much for all coming. It's great to see so many friendly faces here to hear us talk. It's actually Meg who's going to be doing most of the talking, and I'll be asking a few questions. It's not so much a conversation of equal really, because Dame Meg is such an amazing figure in the region, and I've had a few years of interaction being a correspondent, but I've just seen some of the amazing work she's done. So for me, it's an incredible honour to be able to sit here on the same platform as Megan and have this conversation. And I know there's been a lot in the news, and I think that's probably the biggest story today has been the Matildas winning their game last night. And there was one player who was particularly who's been particularly noticeable, and that's Mary Fowler. She's a young PNG Australian woman. Her mother comes from Kirakura village in Port Moresby. When you see the coverage that she's getting and the profile that a PNG Australian woman gets, how does that make you feel?
Very proud. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, getting straight into all this. My friend Solly and I, we had the pleasure of sitting with everybody at South Bank in the open air and watched it on the screen, which was fantastic because you've got everybody there, all nationalities, everybody. But I think, of course, the consensus was that it was people were supporting the Matildas. But when that young Mary Fowler scored that goal, I just thought the kick was very clever the way she did that. But delighted that the Matildas did so well. Did so well.
And when you see a PNG Australian there and in the national spotlight here in Australia, what do you read into that when you see the discussion about her, about Australian and PNG relations?
I look at her as an athlete that has, claimed a space in a very, very crowded space, I would imagine, and contested space for young women to be playing and representing Australia. And the fact that her mother is from Papua New Guinea makes me very, very proud of that. But she's going to find her own way in this world, and I hear that I read somewhere that she'll be playing internationally in Europe, I think, after the line of British.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to get into the geopolitics of it.
Not yet. We'll get to that a little bit later. We'll have a question and answer session later and ask a lot of the questions that I think people will want to ask. So we're going to talk a little bit about Meg and her life, because it's an extraordinary life that she's led. We're here today because Meg has been awarded an honorary doctorate from Griffith University, which is really a lifetime achievement award, really, for the incredible work you've done from back in the 1970s through to now in the region. And you've had a number of engagements, very busy program, media interviews, and you've talked about one thing in particular, which is the Blue Pacific, which has been a long story you've been telling throughout your period of time leading in the Pacific. Can you just explain what is the Blue Pacific?
Well, it's redefining the identity of people from the Pacific. I think there's always been others that have named the South Pacific, the Pacific Islands, or now the conversation more internationally is we're captured by the Indo-Pacific. But the Blue Pacific was it came from the work of people within the Secretariat, particularly my former colleague, Christelle Pratt, who's now working in Brussels at the OACP. The Organisation of Caribbean Pacific and Africa Caribbean Pacific. But drawing from the writings of Apeli Hau'ofa, who was a Tongan man born in Papua New Guinea, did his research for his doctorate in Mekio. I remember as a student, I'd see him coming back with his wife, Barbara, from the field, and then his family were missionaries in Papua New Guinea. He went back to home to Tonga and then to Fiji, where he taught and wrote. But it was his big thinking about how people in the Pacific, they're confined to these spaces of being from an island rather than from a continent, from an ocean continent. So his writings have had a big influence on many people in the Pacific, and I cited some of it at the graduation to get people to think that there is more to the Pacific than, land floating in this large ocean of 40 million square kilometres. But it's an ocean that covers nation states of the Pacific and Aotearoa and the east coast of Australia. And that if you look from space and you look down at the Pacific, it's an extraordinary amount of water there, and we are all part of that. And in Polynesian and Micronesian culture, and I'm sure in the coastal villages of Papua New Guinea too, that the ocean is very much a part of everybody's life. in who they are and their identity. And what's happening now in the Pacific with the tensions that are emerging, people are very concerned, and issues like, and also deep sea mining, and the fact that Japan is now wanting to dispose 1.2 billion tonnes of treated nuclear water in the Pacific, and we've got our fisheries, but the livelihoods of people. All of this is now becoming contested space. And the narrative of the Pacific is about an identity, and particularly for all of us, but for young people. And it was the leaders of the Pacific in 2017 in Samoa who adopted this. So it's not something that is just used by some, and you'll see in documents now across the Pacific. This is a narrative that is open.
And I've spent a few hours with Dame Meg over the last few weeks, or last few days, sorry. And when you talk with Meg, this is the sort of information you get. It's incredibly detailed and broad-ranging historical perspective on what happens here in the region. But I just want to ask you as well. You're from the Highlands, which is a long way away from the coast. Can you tell us a little bit about the Highlands and where you come from?
Well, I mean, my mother's from a province now known as Jawarka, but she's from the Wangi Valley, and my father was part of the first contact expedition in 1934 that went through the islands. He was a patrol officer then. I mean, he first came to then New Guinea to Rabaul in 1926. And on the ship going to Rabaul, he met a man called Mick Clay. And he and the Lay brothers then became like, our families are very close, the girls and the boys and their family and ours. And so in that first expedition, contact was made by my grandfather, who was a tribal leader, a fight leader, with this strange man with pink skin that arrived into the valley, and my mother was a babe in arms, and years later that there was an exchange, well, in that relationship with marriage and my parents. But we were talking today about something that, in those, the Australian government had frowned on fraternisation with natives, so that when he decided he wanted to be with my mother, he was told to get out of the government, and life took a different turn. But a journey of somebody who was a romantic about many parts of Papua New Guinea, and so life in the Highlands for us was one of farming family, particularly in coffee. So that. But my father made his first £1,000 from peanuts and passion fruit. Every time I eat passion fruit, I always say thank you. Because Cotties came and set up a factory. But I mean, the situation of the Highlands in those days is very different to what it is now. I mean, you've got a region of the country that is still very strong in agricultural production, particularly in the coffee and tea industry, but now very much so in the Western Highlands. Near Mount Hagen, there's food, growing vegetables to supply Port Moresby, plus mining camps and oil camps and gas camps and all that. So very lucrative for farmers to be in agriculture, and our leaders talk about how we could feed Asia. We could feed Asia, but you can't do it without good transportation.
And having grown up in the Highlands, you then pretty quickly established yourself in your career as a lawyer. You went to Melbourne University, and I feel like this is like a bit like Dave. This is your life, but I felt like it's researching Meg's story, because you went to Melbourne University and you're the first PNG woman to graduate with a law degree.
But in between that, I went to primary school and high school.
Yes.
Because I never knew, when you grow up in an idyllic situation where the whole world is there for you to play in as a child and create things, didn't care about what was beyond. He just didn't. And then I went to Madang on a DC-3 aircraft and I saw the sea and swam it. You know, it changes one's life. In those days, Papua and New Guinea were two different parts of the country. So we only went to Port Moresby if you had to catch a plane to Australia for high school because we didn't have schools up in Baroka. And one time the aircraft got in too late because of the fog in the Highlands, and I found Port Moresby and explored all these parts of it, and then knew that there was a place there. And then there was the university that was established in 1967, and the first intake were people like Ravi Namalu, Kerry Marata, Charles Lapani. I came in later with the group that came in law school. I was the third group. And then came to Melbourne.
And an extraordinary thing happened really for you as a graduate from law school, because probably it's a dream of most or a lot of graduates from law school would be you actually went straight to helping write the Constitution for Papua New Guinea. No, because.
So what happened was that the transition from self-government to independence was happening in Sir Michael Somari at that time. The Minister advertised for a private secretary and a principal private secretary. So Sir Rabi, who was my very close friend from university, we both applied not knowing that the others applied. Then we both got selected. And that's when we got into that. But the Constitution was really, that was the work of the Constitutional Planning Committee. That was John Wallace, John Cumberton, Bernard Narakobi, with the guidance of Yash Guy, who is the legal advisor, and who I saw just a few years ago in Kenya, where he still lives. But I was on the fringes of it. I don't claim any credit for any of that.
Okay, I'll accept that. My mistake. But you were one of the few women in the administration, and something that a lot of I've spoken with some of your contemporaries, and especially younger women from the Pacific, who said they wanted to hear from you about what it was like what it was like for you as a woman to be there and putting a perspective into the discussion, because it hasn't been really talked about. A lot of the narrative of what happened with independence is assumed under the Somari legacy. So the story of the women involved isn't so well told.
Well, I think there were people in Pangu, like Annie Moitz from Morabi, credit to her, who played a role in all this. And I think there's a book in that for the women who really played significant roles in that. But Naha Rooney from Manus and myself, as young women, were brought in. Naha Rooney and Moyabe, Sir Moy, they were brought in as the political advisors, whereas Sarabi and I were really in the administration. But the public surface did exist. You know, you had people like Philip Baraga for the Papua New Guineans here, who these were the and Jack Karakura, and these were the men who ran. They were the senior Papua New Guineans. It was a very interesting dynamic, because they looked at those of us who'd gone through university as really a bunch of people who read books and didn't know much about the actual running of the country. And Philip Baraga used to say to me, if you were a district key up in like a young patrol officer in my administration, I would send you to the remotest place in the country with no book. Yes. Yeah. So it was, but over the years after that, there was, you know, when I was ambassador to the US, there were women who were heads of department. There were in the middle management of the public service. There are a lot of senior women. That has really declined.
Mm-hmm.
But people who are very good administrators.
The situation for women in Papua New Guinea isn't great, though, is it?
No, I don't think it is. I think that the situation has declined. I think patriarchy has really taken over, where the voice of women is not heard. I think that there are attitudes towards, you know, the situation for women. I think in the private sector, there's been very good gains. If you look at the statistics in relation to where women are involved in commerce and in private sector in other countries, particularly as holding senior management positions, middle management, or on boards, done much better than it has in the private, than it has in the public sector. And that shouldn't be so, because the public sector serves the nation, and you need to see more women there. In Parliament, we only have 2 women who are members of Parliament, and that's a terrible track record.
So we've talked a lot about PNG. We're going to have to jump into the Pacific, because I think that's why we're here. And so I'm glad you mentioned that you're ambassador to the US for Papua New Guinea, but you also worked for the World Bank two Washington-based institutions. You're very familiar with Americans and American ways. This week, the Women's World Cup hasn't been the only story on the agenda. We've also seen a number of US dignitaries come through town. It's been a very, very busy time in Brisbane. You might have seen some motorcades around. The streets are blocked on. Did you get to meet with any of the visiting delegations? No? Well, from what you've seen from their visiting here, and also in PNG, and also we've had the French president in New Caledonia and Vanuatu and doing the rounds there, and obviously going to Moresby. What are you making of all this shuttle diplomacy?
Well, I think everybody who's following discussions online will see that The Economist has come out with an article on that, which I didn't read, because I don't want it to have any influence of how I think at the moment. And I know that other journalists are writing about this. Why are we, the Pacific, such a focus, and Papua New Guinea in particular? I think that the absence of the United States from the Pacific is really noticed. I think I was ambassador from 1989 to 95, and there was a full-fledged embassy in Port Moresby in those days. US AIIA, US AID, and then had also the military side of it. Because at that time there was the State of Forces Agreement that came into play in 1989, I believe. And that's part of the basis of why the US is back in Papua New Guinea, because we had that. And that was so that you can have overflights to the country at the very early stage. The situation then, once the Soviet Union broke up, it was interesting. The US ambassador was the best friend to the Soviet ambassador in Port Moresby, because they could both speak Russian, and the Russian ambassador actually needed a friend, and it was the US ambassador. But the situation then is that there was a withdrawal from many parts of the Pacific and other parts of the world, and there has been a re-engagement. Before the elections, I think when Hillary Clinton, was that 2017, that election?
16.
Yeah, so senior officials from the US were visiting in the Pacific and having conversations with many of us and asking a very interesting question: what is it that we can do to build a long-term relationship in the Pacific? So what would you answer to that?
Well, could I ask you a question? What is the greatest threat to the Pacific as perceived by the Pacific Island nations?
Fine.
And in your speech accepting your doctorate, you said, as our region captures the attention of powers beyond our shores, embarking on a path of militarization, our unity and strength will be put to the test. What are you concerned about there?
I think that the interest of powers driven by their strategic interest. No, I mean, I think that's a fact. You know, why do you want to have why do you want to have access to airfields and ports in Papua New Guinea? Why do you want to have access to airfields and ports in Australia? It's about the strategic interest of the United States and concerns about China. So I think, you know, in the Pacific, the issue is some of the countries that were part of recognizing Taiwan have now shifted their alliances and their interest to China. Kiribati and Solomon Islands, and I know for Australia, there's a lot of interest in the Solomon Islands. My interest is really in Kiribati. Kiribati has 5 million square kilometres, you've been there, of EEZ. Their outer islands, Kiritimati, is just not very far from Hawaii. airfields on islands there have been upgraded by China. And did people know that? No, but many in the Pacific, we knew about it long before what was going on, because people talk, right? And you go there, you have to land there on your way to Hawaii if you go from Fiji, so you talk to people on aircraft, what's going on, and just seeing what's going on in that part. It's not an isolated part of Kiribati any longer. It's got all the fishing vessels are coming in there and processing of cannery. I think the militarization concerns me. The Pacific has always stood for a peaceful part of the Pacific. And, you know, in history, you've always had powers that have come in and out and moved across. And the former Prime Minister, Samoa Tuilepa, used to talk about this. But, you know, he'd say, don't worry about it, we can handle all this. But I think that the situation now is the concerns are, well, the interests of the superpowers are exacerbated, and I think that there's real issues in terms of the solidarity of the Pacific.
And the interests of those superpowers, are they taking the interests of the Pacific Islanders, are they focusing on those, or are they coming along with something else that maybe isn't the priority of the Pacific?
I think that there's a very clever approach. The language and the narrative of the Pacific is picked up by the superpowers, particularly the United States and Australia, in terms of the Blue Pacific Partnership. What is the Blue Pacific Partnership? That is how they're going to be involved in the development issues or to capture the aspirations of the Pacific. But I think the test for the Pacific will be is whether, and I believe that they will hold together, is I think I want to believe that there is a much deeper current of commitment between our countries to the Pacific way, that we will respect each other and we will always support each other. And there may be differences, but we will come back together. And I think that's the only thing that's going to hold us together. But, you know, the US is much more aggressive in whining and dining the Pacific leaders now in Washington, and people are influenced by this.
The Chinese people have been living in the Pacific for, well, possibly hundreds of years, but definitely since the colonizing powers came into the region and needed a labor force. There's been trade between China and the Pacific for a very, very long time. The Chinese have been a associate member of the Pacific Forum. Is it? No, as a dialogue partner of the Pacific Forum since the 1990s. It's been at least a couple of decades. So they've been engaged with the Pacific, but suddenly they've popped up, especially around 2018, they popped up as this major threat to the region. Is that how it's perceived in the Pacific, and during your time as a general secretary?
You said threat. I don't say threat.
Oh no, I didn't say threat. I was distilling how it's presented to us in Australian media here. Is it a threat, or is it a partner?
The Chinese have their embassies throughout the Pacific, and those of you who travel, you know, heard of that. I think the difference is, in the region was when you had 7 countries that acknowledged Taiwan, and then the rest acknowledged China. Now, I think it's only Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, and Palau and now that recognize Taiwan. And of course, the US interest in securing Taiwan exacerbates attention. And the countries in the Pacific then have to be very much aware of that.
Okay, and there's so much more I want to ask Meg, but we could talk for hours. We have already over the last few days. But you obviously all come here as well because you're interested in this discussion. So I think it's probably time that we get some questions from you. What I'd like to do is, if please identify yourself when you're asking a question. And if you're here as a member of an organisation, could you identify what organisation that is as well? So, okay. Can we have hands up to? Do we have some of the Pacific Islanders, I think, start with, given the discussion we're having? there's enough of you in the room.
Oh, oh.
All right, okay. That's back there. Thank you.
Shall I stand up or sit? I'm Eleonora Aoki, and I'm social worker and also PNG community here in Brisbane. I just want to ask you, how strong is national security in Papua New Guinea?
You mean in terms of defense?
In terms of international security in Papua New Guinea as a whole.
Sorry,
Okay,
awareness about it?
Let's put it this way. If Chinese are coming into the country
Yeah.
and doing drillings and stuff like that, as a fishing industry, for example, as a cover-up, I want to know, is there national security in that?
China has a strong presence in Papua New Guinea. China's, you'll recall during the APEC meetings, the president of China came to Papua New Guinea, stayed in Papua New Guinea for several nights, had discussions with leaders from all over the APEC region, etc. I think that China's involvement in the development of Papua New Guinea is particularly in infrastructure is really important with the roads, etc. In the Highlands, a lot of the roads that are being built now, or refurbished now, the Highlands Highway, is done by Chinese contractors with Papua New Guineans, but the money is coming from the Asian Development Bank. There's a real irony in that. I think that in the fishing industry, it's not just the Chinese. You've also got Filipino companies and other companies that are right through the Pacific. Licenses are given out for fisheries through the foreign fisheries. I think that China's interest in the Pacific is about economic progress, because that's the discussions that they have with our leaders. Yes, there's always the activity of Chinese in Papua New Guinea, particularly, is a concern to, especially if they own trade stores. It's not just the Chinese. There's also other Asian groups that are coming in that start trade stores that upset local people, because it is also about taking livelihoods away from other people.
So, sorry if I may continue. I was looking at 60 Minutes maybe some times ago in regard to Solomon Islands.
Mm-hmm.
Some traditional owners are not very happy that Chinese getting into occupying their land and stuff like that, using local government or national government in there, not negotiating with the village people and going in and bribing people with money to occupy their land. Is that the fact or just people talking?
I can't verify it, so put it that way. But there are, the presence of Chinese in Solomon Islands is grown because of the relationship there.
I'll come to you next thing. This gentleman here.
Yeah, Ken Waldron, and I'm from Mediators Beyond Borders, AIIA. You made an observation earlier on about the threat being climate.
Yes.
And the discussion got hijacked a bit by big power battle.
Yeah.
Would you like to elaborate a bit more on how you see the threat manifesting over time? Like, as, for example, seafaring communities suddenly having to transfer to become arable farmers, and those difficulties and disruptions.
If you ask Pacific leaders what is the greatest security threat in the region, it is climate. And it's about what's happening right now in terms of the sea level rise, and particularly the impact on atoll countries, like if you look at Tuvalu and Kiribati. But also what's happening now is coastal areas in most of the island are now impacted. Fiji is now moving communities from coastal areas up to higher ground because they've had to migrate because of inundation. I think that whilst other powers are looking at the strategic issues, the Pacific's focus is about survival. We get a lot of help from the Australian government, particularly working with SPC and PIFs in terms of legal issues about economic zones, the boundaries there. Also, there are the issues around international treaties like UNCLOS that don't deal with when definitions of statehood talks about land and not just sea. So all of this work is going to have to be done because if people over the next 30 to 50th century, all those islands disappear, what happens to those people? The people migrate onto in Kiribati, they have taken bought land in Vanuatu in Fiji. But they're not farmers, they're not agriculturists, they're seafaring people. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration. I think I wanted to mention this because last year in December, the United Nations, by consensus vote, have now agreed to submissions to the International Court of Justice for state responsibilities and climate. And this is really a big issue that's been led by Vanuatu. But it was they were urged by law students at the USP at Port Vila campus that states make all these commitments about how they're going to give money for mitigation and for adaptation. But if you look at the funding, climate finance is not there. But it's not just about money that's the issue. It's the behavioural pattern of all of us has to change. And this country is still one of the greatest polluters in terms of in fossil fuels, and and we should just have those conversations and look at how we're going to deal with that if we're all going to survive. The Pacific, many of the peoples there will have to move; they will have to leave.
And secondly, and you've just been in Fiji for talks around that non-binding advisory opinion that the General Assembly has sought. What does that actually mean? Because it got a lot of publicity. It was passed unanimously by the General Assembly. But what happens when they go to the International Court of Justice and get an advisory opinion on state responsibility?
Well, some people might say, well, if you go to the International Court of Justice and you're getting an advisory opinion, it's just an advisory opinion. But that's a huge step forward. You will build on that. I would hope in international case law that you will be able to argue further on what are the obligations of those states. So if you have those obligations, but what do those obligations mean? Does it mean loss and damage? And a lot of countries don't want to even talk about that. They, oh, hang on a minute, we made these promises at the Paris COP and we're fulfilling that, but they're not. 100 billion was promised, 100 billion per annum for this, and that funding has not happened. So for countries that are trying to prepare themselves for what's going to happen in the future, there's just not those resources. So what happened in Fiji was that it was not a workshop, it was a right shop, it was the drafting that's already started now. And hopefully all the countries in the Pacific will get their drafting done as countries particularly in the Caribbean. The island states are the ones that are really at the forefront. But for a country like Papua New Guinea, we're very much involved in that too, because it's not just about the coastal areas. The highlands is going to suffer now from drought. And if you can't feed people, you've got issues.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Dame Meg. Ian Kemish. Tonight I'm here as an industry fellow at Griffith Asia Institute. Dame Meg, just thinking about self-determination and unresolved self-determination in the Pacific. I'm thinking about the French Pacific. I'm thinking about an independentist party elected in French Polynesia recently, a series of referenda in New Caledonia that don't appear to please everybody. And then, of course, in your own country, we have Bougainville, still an unresolved issue. Could you talk to that theme a little bit, how you see that playing out across the region?
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting that Macron referred to the new imperialists. When you had France very much part of, entrenched in the Pacific. And it was interesting because I know from talking to Kanaks in Fiji that they were waiting for Macron to talk about another referendum. Because he was there for a few days before he went to Vanuatu and nothing was said, nothing. But I think there's going to be some an approach that the French government will take on this. I think I'm for French Polynesia to have a complete switch from a conservative, from a very pro-France party to now to one on independence. Oscar Temaru, in his old age, must be just delighted, because that man has given all his life to the Tahitian people and what it means for them and their identity. I don't think it's going to come easily, but I think you've got experts on that here in Australia, people who write. Nick McClellan knows much more about this than I do. But I think there's got to be a question about further referendum. Now, the issue of territories becoming members of the Pacific Island Forum changes the dynamics also within those organisations, because you've got metropolitan powers actually sitting in there. That was a decision of leaders, certainly not on the advice of little people like me as secretary. I think that those constructs are very interesting, and then you've got the South Pacific community, what do you call it, the Pacific Community, which was the South Pacific Commission, and you've got a big role that France and the metropolitan powers that are part of that, playing that, influencing what happens in the Pacific. Yes, it's a technical organisation, but it's more than that. It's about how you have a seat at tables so that Pacific leaders are interacting with you all along. I didn't give you the answer to that question that the Americans gave, asked me what is it that will be done for a long-term relationship with the Pacific. My answer to them was, why don't you invest in the education of our young people at the universities on the mainland, not just in Hawaii, but on the mainland? And the response was, that would be a hard sell, ma'am. So who is educating a lot of our young people for the future? China. We send plane loads. Yeah, I don't get a reaction from people when I say that. Like, how? Really? So what's going to happen in the future? If you're thinking about, if you're articulating, democratic institutions and democracy for the region, etc. China's approach, we all know that it's very different. They're much more autocratic about how they run a country. And now in my country, we have young people now that have all come back, and they have very different views of the world to my generation and their parents' generation. So these are the things in terms of societies that we have to.
Got some questions from the web.
Oh, I've got some, okay, sorry.
Okay, the first one is from Sarah McCartney. She says, thank you for sharing your story. How do you see Pacific worldviews and philosophies and cultural diplomacy shaping the future we want and need? And also, how do you see the future of Pacific identity?
Sorry, the first one?
How do you see Pacific worldviews and philosophies and cultural diplomacy shaping the future we want or need?
What's a PhD, isn't it?
I think that the views that people like myself have are not necessarily the views that the youth have, and I think that we've got to make sure that the young people are really thinking about what they see. So you've got very active civil society, you've got very active youth groups as a Pacific group, are very focused on the challenges that I've just spoken about, climate, and how they see what the priorities are, because they know it's going to impact them and their future and their livelihoods.
Do we have another one?
Yes. The other one is from Tao. He says, could you please direct me to any recent literature that discusses the perspective of Pacific nations on China, specifically addressing current developments and shifts in relations?
I think the answer to that is
Oh,
Google it, mate.
Google.
Did it say?
Oh, the answer is to Google it, because there's plenty of literature.
Yeah.
I just want to pick
This
up
young
on,
man here hasn't said that.
I just want to pick up a point from what Ian was saying
Yeah.
about what's happening in the Pacific, because Ian asked about Bougainville, and I'd be interested to know your views on what the prospects of independence are from Bougainville, given in the way that PNG processes it. But also, we couldn't have that question without asking about West Papua and where is West Papua at, and has it actually moved forward anywhere in terms of its or the freedom fighters movement there in terms of independence?
I was just listening to, if you go on, or I can forward to you a lecture that was a discussion just like the other day with Anthony Regan about what's happening on Bougainville with regard to Bougainville and the delays in terms of, I mean, there are all these steps that have to be followed, and then the situation in terms of, what the government of Papua New Guinea was, so where they're always at. And because of the complexities, but also because of COVID, those processes were constantly delayed going forward. I think that there is now a real push to try and get this resolution as to what will happen. But I can't give you the detail because I don't know, I have not been involved in those discussions as to what the next steps are. But there's processes that have to be followed in terms of the joint parties for negotiations before it was there.
Are you feeling optimistic that there's prospects for both of them?
I don't know what I won't say because I don't know enough about. I know that in Bougainville, and as a citizen of Papua New Guinea watching all this, my view is that there was a referendum that was held, and the decision was by the majority that Bougainville should be independent.
97.7%.
As a Papua New Guinean that comes from a United State, as much as I respect that desire, I felt the pain of a part of us that would move away. But it's not my place to stand to block anything, or if I was had that power, is to support the people who want to make this future for themselves and find the best way to do it. But that's a process that has to be followed in terms of the constitutional process.
And West Papua, how do you?
West Papua, the Pacific leaders had asked for the United Nations to send a mission in there on human rights, because that's as far as the language of the outcomes of the forum always started to get watered down. It started off very strongly about the interests of people in West Papua, but then you could see that some of the countries were much more anxious about their relationship with Indonesia. And also, I think Australia very pro Indonesia, but the concern of many of the other nations in the Pacific Island Forum was about the human rights issues, and an independent mission from the United Nations to go in there to verify what was happening to people needed to be done. It's not been done.
Gentleman at the back there.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Meg. It's nice to see you again. You've spent the afternoon.
Sorry, could you just identify yourself?
Sorry, Samit Suleiman at Griffith University. You just spent the afternoon at Gallery of Modern Art previewing the new exhibition, SIS. I was just wondering if you'd reflected much on the important work that contemporary art does in cultivating the kind of imaginative geographies that you've been striving so hard for in your political life.
That's a fascinating question. I've not always been a collector of the contemporaries, but not very interested in the traditional. But it was wonderful to see the exhibition isn't up there. You know, the space is huge, and it's going to be wonderful to see the work, particularly on a lot of women that we all know. But the work that's already there, Mary Gold and her pottery, and the Lapita pottery that done in Fiji. So the point of your question was?
What work does this kind of activity, creative art, creative expression, play in cultivating the political imaginary that you've been striving for, the Blue Pacific and this space of
Yeah, I think that it's interesting for me that I think that the poetry comes from a lot of young people in Micronesia and in Polynesia. The writing in Papua New Guinea used to be very much alive at independence, particularly the playwrights. and theatre, etc. And you don't see that much more. But the street art in Papua New Guinea is fascinating because it captivates what's happening at a time. And I do have a collection of all the things that happened in Bougainville and particularly sandlines, because I was involved in the sandline issue. So all those paintings that were on the street about sandline, I bought because it's the way somebody heard the news. And also you'll see paintings with satellites and telecommunication. And to me, that was for a man on the street to paint that because he'd heard something about it on the radio or seen it on a television screen about what was happening in satellites and stuff like that. All of this is about how people see the world. I think that I think that the creativity in Papua New Guinea is really quite extraordinary because we have people from all over the place. We've got our traditional art, but we've also got our contemporary. It's very interesting in other parts of the Pacific, and others may disagree, but I think Polynesia dance and music is very much part of their art in a very formalized fashion. But I think in terms of painting in it, it's not as rich, and carving is not as rich as it is in Melanesia.
Got time for one more question? Sorry. Yeah. I'll take it from you.
Frederica Steen, refugee advocate here in Brisbane. For more than 20 years, my life has been on hold waiting for a solution to the human rights abuses of asylum seekers. And the Pacific has been has been imposed on by my country to hold people who were seeking protection from persecution. I'm really interested to hear, because I've never heard it discussed, what was the discussion within the Pacific Islands Forum about Nauru and PNG Mars Island being the offshore detention centres for asylum seekers that were Australia's responsibility?
That's a very important question in the slow discussion because it was seen as bilateral arrangements. I think there was concern, amongst people, but in terms of a public statement, nothing. Yeah. But it's interesting because I went to Nauru several times. I did they wouldn't take me into the heart of the detention centre there, but over time, as people were released and very much integrated into life in Nauru, was very interesting. People seem to have made a life for themselves there. And yes, it's not like they can go back to their country or come to other developed countries, but interesting assimilation. And then there were some refugees that were then sent to the United States, and they asked if they could come back because they didn't have a community to be assimilated with, and they weren't comfortable where they went and wanted to come back again. I think Manus is another story. Yeah, and I as a Papua New Guinean would get really angry with people the way they talked about Manus, as if Manus was just a place where not much else happened other than that centre. Manus, these were the people from a very early stage during the Paleol movement, educated young women in the 50s and men. They were the people who ran our public service. They were the people who led in our universities, who were the people that I learned from. And it was just so insulting the way people in Australia would just refer to Manus as if they were,
Hellhole.
Hellhole. And it's not like that. So
One very quick question.
Yeah, I'll try and make it quick.
There's this young man here.
My name's Colin Forrest. I'm a member of the council of the AIIA Queensland. I'll try and make it quick. AUKUS, nuclear-powered submarines in our Navy. What does the Blue Pacific leadership think of that?
It's the interpretation of the Treaty of Rarotonga that most of the Pacific have, and including Australia, have signed up. And Australia says there will not be nuclear weapons on those submarines. The question here is, how do you verify if any of those submarines have nuclear weapons on board? So I noticed that the chair of the forum first came out raising concerns, and then after discussions with the United States or Australia, I would imagine, changed their mind that it's not a breach of the Treaty of Rarotonga. But it'd be a very one to be contested, and if you look at New Zealand's approach, it's very different. They're adhering to the treaty because they ask if you are armed or not. Am I correct in that? Anyone?
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're pretty much,
Go
I think we've got enough time for one more.
Shall we have time?
Yeah, go ahead.
My name's Aaron, I'm a PhD student at the University of Queensland. My question is regarding infrastructure investment by China specifically, and how Australia, New Zealand, the US, and potentially Japan have responded to that. What you think they could do differently to make it more effective and to present a more viable alternative to China in regards to infrastructure investment, and also in terms of building up climate resilience mechanisms. What do you think they could do?
So there are two different questions there. One is in regard to infrastructure, and there's been some very good research done by a scholar at AIIA, and I think that next year, 2024, this information will be made more public. Pete Connolly, who's written on China and Melanesia and the infrastructure investments there. As I said earlier, from what I understand, is that a lot of the infrastructure in Melanesia is done through the Asian Development Bank, and the majority shareholder of the Asian Development Bank is China and the United States. So here we are, they're talking about China, but China has put the bids in for those contracts, and they're doing that. So what should the response of Australia and New Zealand be on that? Well, Australia has a fund that they have. I haven't seen anything. I think they're in the process of now drawing down on 2 projects within the region. So it's not as if the Chinese have got a workforce. And yes, this is the issue and the complaints in many countries around the world is if you're coming into my countries, don't bring your workforce with you. Because the Chinese insisted they bring their workforce. And if you go to countries in Africa, you will see that there is a huge Chinese workforce. I think it was Rwanda was the country who said, don't bring in an external workforce, you use our people. So it's how they manage. In terms of a climate resilient fund, so I think a lot of work has been done recently to improve a concept that we developed when I was Secretary General about a Pacific Resilience Facility. Because money that goes into the Green Climate Fund, the climate finance, is very hard to access, very hard to access. And I understand, I think the Australian government has withdrawn its money, is that correct? My view is great. Make that money available within the Pacific so that people within the communities can be getting themselves organised about how they're going to adapt to climate change. The Pacific Resilience Facility can capture that and be run really well. Then you've got alternate finance immediately. What happens is everything gets complicated in AIIA, and we've got to go through all these different steps before you can get access to any funds. And the climate adaptation funds are going to be critical. Not mitigation, adaptation.
Okay, just a quick one for me. We look at how contested the Pacific's become, and you've been involved in the region for a very long time now. Do you feel like, do you hanker to the days when it was a lot easier and you weren't in this international spotlight constantly and there wasn't talk about securitizing the region? Or is now the time that the Blue Pacific continent really takes its place in the international order of things?
There's a political process without a strong economic base, except for our fisheries, which, yes, but I think it's 50% of our fish is consumed by Europe. But on the climate side, all that fish is moving too. You need to know because of the heating of the ocean. I would like to see. I don't like this contestation for the Pacific region at all. I worry about the future in that sense. I'm sure. I mean, all of you don't want to see a war. I just think there's a very aggressive approach by the West, and I'll be frank about that. What is China's move on this? I'm not a Chinese scholar. I want to know more as much as anybody else of what China is thinking. China invests in the long term, and China's not making a move. They're not saying anything. So you get comments about all this this bullying that's going on. I want to know where the bullying is happening. Yeah, I really do. Not because it's just because the United States said, but I think that if we say things like this and try and capture a narrative so that people in the region can start worrying and fearing for it, then you better justify it. Our leaders in the Pacific have to be very firm about what's in the interest of the Pacific. And the interest of the Pacific right now is climate. And it's for all of us.
Thank you very much. Now, this is Meg's last engagement on this visit to Australia. But she's done an amazing job while she's been here, talked to so many people. It's your energy and enthusiasm, and from all the years I've seen you in action back at the forum and now, it's just amazing. And thank you very much. It's been a pleasure sitting here chatting with you. And I'd now like to hand over to Tiffany Kane, the convener of the Pacific Hub at
Yes.
AIIA Institute.
Thank you, Stefan. It's my pleasure to offer a vote of thanks this evening. I'd like to start by thanking AIIA Queensland for co-hosting this event with Griffith Asia Institute, and also my colleagues at the Institute who have helped put this together. Thank you all for being here, and for those of you online, I think you'll agree that as we promised, it's been an invigorating and entertaining and highly informative conversation. Stefan, thank you for everything that you've done in the lead up to today. I know you've put in a lot of preparation, and I think we are very fortunate to have had the benefit of your intellect and your heart that you brought to this conversation. Yeah. And Meg, thank you from the bottom of my heart for allowing me to put together not just this evening but your whole program, and for your wholehearted commitment to sharing your wisdom, your love for the region, your hopes for the future, and your challenges for those of us that are hoping to play a part in that. So Lewis is going to bring up two small gifts, one each. Thank you to Tupala Lobi, Pala Gupala work for you. Thank you, Tomas. Freeman?
I would say thank you very much to young people who, many of you who are with spent time with yesterday afternoon for making time to be here. Thank you.
Can I also echo Tessa's thanks to everyone here, especially to Stefan and Dame Meg. Leaves me only to remind you about some upcoming events we have with AIIAQ. So next week on Tuesday, the 8th of August, right here at Holding Redlich, we will be continuing the conversation around Australia's engagement with the Pacific, where Leata Alia Moana, who is Queensland's Trade Commissioner for the Pacific, the first, as I understand, to be appointed to such a role in 2003, March 2003, will be talking to us about growth among neighbours, Queensland as Australia's Pacific state. To give you a taster of what to expect, Leata has said this: Queensland considers itself as Australia's gateway to the Pacific, being just short flights away from various Pacific countries. This opens up trade and investment opportunities for both people of Queensland and the Pacific. At the end of the month, we have Dr. Sarah Percy coming to speak with us on the 23rd of August about her new book, Forgotten Warriors, A History of Women on the Front Line. Dr. Percy is an Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Queensland. She has recently been interviewed on the ABC Radio National's Conversations program regarding her book. And her publishers will also be attending on the evening so that anyone interested can purchase copies of that book. There are more events scheduled throughout the year and certainly in September. We invite you to have a look and keep an eye on the website and your newsletter. And I hope to see you soon at the next event.
Yeah.